who God means you to be? You know, some of you may have knowingly started. Maybe you're reading your Bible a little bit closely. Maybe you're praying a little bit harder. Maybe you're really focused on your devotional life. And some of you have started your journeys and you don't even know that you've started them yet. That's where Moses is in today's reading. Moses doesn't realize that God's had him on this journey for 80 years by the time he's seen the bush. Moses just thinks he's floating around through life. He doesn't realize that God had a plan for him right from the first moment, and that God's been getting him ready. You know, the problem with Moses today is he wanted to be in charge. He wanted control, and he wanted God to be his co-pilot. How often have we said that? God is my co-pilot. You know, we say it like it's a good thing. God's my co-pilot. He's with me right by my side. We've all said that. We think it's a good thing. Who wouldn't want God in the car seat next to him? My dad certainly did when he had me on his lap, let me drive. That's a crazy thing to do. Or when you're in an airplane, God as your co-pilot's a really good thing. And that's where it first came from. That saying, God is my co-pilot, it was first said by Colonel Robert Lee Scott Jr. At age 34, he was considered too old to be a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. So he found his old Air Force. He joined up with the Flying Tigers. It was a small group of fighter pilots who flew in China against the Japanese. And he flew on some really, really dangerous missions. So he wrote a book, God is my co-pilot. There was a movie, you can find it on Amazon. I've seen the movie a couple times. So God was his co-pilot. That was a very good thing. But Christy and I, we've just come back from a journey through Indiana, southern Illinois. We've covered a lot of miles this last couple weeks. And we're driving through Prairie du Chien, and we drove past the Baptist church. And I see this church every Monday when I come back from seminary. And this pastor always has the best signs out there. One of my favorites was, sign is broken, message inside. I thought, that's a great sign. But I can't take it. I can't steal it. So on Thursday, we're coming home. And the sign was changed. And I told Christy, I said, watch this. This guy always has good signs. And the sign said, if God is your co-pilot, switch seats. If God is your co-pilot, switch seats. And we started thinking, wow, that means we got to give up control. Do we really want to give up control to God and let him take over? If God is your co-pilot, that means you're still in charge. You're still driving that plane. But when you turn over controls, that means he's in charge. That means we have to go wherever he flies us without question, because we don't have control anymore. If Jesus is truly Lord, then it means we have to turn over everything to him. It means we can't say, Jesus is Lord, but... Or Jesus is Lord except for this one thing I need to hold on to because I just can't let it go. And we think about in today's reading, where would Moses be if God was his co-pilot instead of his pilot? Where would the Israelites be if God was his co-pilot? 5 times in Exodus 3 and 4, Moses tries to take control of that plane. So let's see what happens when Moses is the pilot. The first time that Moses tried to be the pilot of his own plane was in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing that no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So Moses looked both ways to make sure that he was safe, and he killed the Egyptian. Problem was, somebody was watching. And Moses had to leave everything behind. He had to leave the palace. He had no more princely duties. He had to leave the girl who's going to be his wife. He had to leave it all behind and run out to the desert because he was in charge. And instead of asking God, Lord, how do I help my people? How do I get them freed? What should I do? He took things into his own hands and he drove that plane right into the ground. And he had to leave. Didn't work out for Moses too well that day. There's 5 more times that Moses tried to be the pilot. And let's see how Moses' excuses worked out for him. In verses 10 and 11, today's readings, God selects Moses, who's a pretty good shepherd, to go to Egypt and take his people, guide his people out of Egypt. Here's what God said. So now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses knew how badly the Israelites were being treated in Egypt. He even killed an Egyptian because he saw how terrible it was. Yet when God asked him to do something, he said, send somebody else. I can't go. If I go back, they might kill me. But here God is asking Moses, a murderer, to be his man, to be his person, to be the freer. Moses had first rejected God's command to go and save the Israelites because Moses felt inadequate to do God's work. But all that God needed to save his people was a shepherd. That's what Moses was. He just needed someone with the courage to go out on his own and guide people through. In Acts chapter 7, it tells us something else about Moses. In chapter 7, verses 22 through 23, we are told that God prepared Moses for 40 years in Egypt before Moses killed an Egyptian. So for 40 years he was being trained as a warrior, as a speaker, as a prince. For 40 years he was being trained, but Moses forgot all about that when God asked him to do some work for him. He forgot. And then as we just heard, Moses was also a shepherd for 40 years. Shepherds were people who went out by themselves into the wild, into the desert, and made sure that defenseless things were safe against attackers, against marauders. So God picked the right person. For 40 years, this guy Moses was trained to be a speaker, was trained to be a warrior, was trained to be a shepherd, somebody who could guide people over a long distance. Finally, next week, you guys are going to have to come back next week. We're going to go through Numbers 13 and 14, where we find out that Moses spent another 40 years preparing his people for the promised land. 40, 40, 40. It's amazing the way the Bible works. Unfortunately, every time that we're called to God, sometimes we forget how we're trained also. That's why I asked the girls to just jot a couple notes down this summer as they feel like they're being trained for something, so that they can look back on it. Because unfortunately, we have to look back at our lives now, and we have to look and see, how did God prepare me to do the things that I'm doing now? How did he do it? How did he prepare us? Because as we're going through trials, sometimes we go, God, why me? Why do I have to go through this now? Why did my mother have bipolar disorder? So I could talk to Amanda, and I could talk to Kendall. Why did God not send me to a Methodist church so I can hear Scripture and learn how to read the Bible? Because I had to do other stuff first. And we don't know that until we stand right here and look backwards and say, that's why he did it. That's why. That's where Moses is today. Except Moses keeps coming up with excuses. God even gave Moses some other stuff. In verse 12, God says, I will be with you. I will be with you. And then the kicker, he gives Moses a guarantee. He says, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship on this mountain. Notice God didn't say, if you get out of Egypt, then maybe you can worship on this mountain. God said, when you get out of Egypt with my people, then you can worship here. So God's with them, with Moses. God guarantees Moses he'll succeed. So when we get all that, we expect Moses to just take off, right? And go. No, he doesn't. He says, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your father has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? More excuses. Have we ever done that? Have we ever given God excuses when he asks us to do something? Nah. God responds, tell them I am who I am. And we know by now that whenever God says that, he means, I'm God and you're not. It's all you need to tell them. And then to make it better, tell them I'm the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And God has sent me to you. But even with God's guarantee and the knowledge that God will be with Moses, Moses still tries to get out of the job. When you get a chance this week, read Exodus 4. And to me, it was funny seeing Moses interact with God. Just read it. I'm going to go through some of those real quick. So God gives Moses the power to turn his staff into a snake, because surely that will impress the Israelites. And then he says, when you stick your hand in your robe, it'll turn leprous. When you take it out, you can show people you have leprosy. When you put it back, it'll be gone. That's another miracle. Then God says, if that doesn't work, take some water from the Nile. It'll turn to blood. He gives Moses 3 miracles to convince people if telling them that God sent me wasn't enough. And even these 3 miracles aren't enough for Moses. Here's what Moses says in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. Moses says, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Moses forgot the training he had in the palace. All of a sudden he can't speak because God has something for him to do. He trained Moses for 40 years to be a prince, 40 more years as a shepherd. Gives Moses 3 different miracles to convince people. And now he's even going to help Moses speak. So finally, Moses has enough stuff, right? Finally, Moses is going to go on this task. Right? You guys know the story. Moses just takes all this and goes, right? No. Again, he says, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send somebody else. After everything God has given him, all the training that God has given him, Moses says, just send somebody else. I can't do it. When we read Exodus, we need to know that if one of the greatest prophets of all time felt uncomfortable taking on a task, we can feel uncomfortable too. But we need to remember the first thing that Moses said. Here I am. If Moses would have stopped right there and said, here I am, and go, would have been different. But God let us see Moses in his weakness so he could tell us it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be unsure of yourself. It's okay to tell me no. But sooner or later, I'm going to keep coming back. And I hope you say yes. So when God calls out to you and asks you to do anything, it's okay to turn it down a couple times. But remember, sooner or later, you need to say, here I am. Because we know one last thing. There was a time in Matthew 19 when the disciples were concerned because Jesus said, it's easier for a camel to get through an eye of a needle for a rich man to go to heaven. And at that time, the Hebrews thought, well, if you're rich, you're already blessed. So the disciples were confused and they said, Lord, who then can be saved? And Jesus told them, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. So when God calls you and asks you to do his task, realize you're not there all by yourself. And what he's asking you to do might be impossible for you, but not for him. We can't go it alone. and we're not intended to.